Chapter 3, Release. The Power of Letting Go. I was staring back at myself in a mirror, fully dressed in an authentic stormtrooper costume. The moment was the culmination of a decades-long dream I had harbored ever since one of my older brothers planted an idea in my 6-year-old mind. Wouldn't it be so cool to own a real stormtrooper costume like they have in the movies? The combination of the hype around the Return of the Jedi release, along with the instant appeal of any suggestion coming from an older sibling, burned this idea into my mind. It resided there quietly, unquestioned, until I was standing in the store 30 years later looking at myself costumed from head to toe. In that moment I clearly saw that not one part of me actually wanted to own a stormtrooper costume. The idea had been added as a to-do in my brain 3 decades before, then had slid beneath my consciousness. Evidently, it had been in my head all this time, taking up mental space. Do you have any items like this living rent-free in your mind? Outdated goals, suggestions, or ideas that sneak into your brain long ago and took up permanent residence? Mindsets that have outlived their usefulness but have been part of you for so long you barely even notice them? Anna now uses a shorthand phrase with me to describe this experience. When I think of acting on some suggestion without giving it proper consideration, she'll ask me, "Is this a stormtrooper?" Stormtroopers can take many forms: regrets that continue to haunt us, grudges we can't seem to let go of, expectations that were realistic at some point but are now getting in our way. These intruders are like unnecessary applications running in the background of your computer, slowing down all its other functionality. At first they might not seem to affect your speed and agility, but as they keep accumulating one after another, eventually your operating system starts to run slower. You forget the name of someone you just met. You read and reread the same paragraph without comprehending it. Your brain hurts trying to make simple decisions like what groceries to buy at the store. Tiny mistakes expand a footprint in your brain and start seeming like huge failures. To reclaim that space in your brain, you need to send these stormtroopers packing. Focus on what you have. The French author Guy de Maupassant tells the story of one Mater Hodgcorn, an industrious man who strove to be an upstanding member of his community. That is, until he was falsely accused of an act he did not commit. His supposed crime was picking up someone's lost wallet off the sidewalk. In fact, it was a piece of string, and failing to return it. He was innocent, but the rumor spread from neighbor to neighbor, and soon people in the town where he lived started to judge him harshly. They began treating him differently. In short, they ostracized him. He could have let the matter go. He could have forgiven his accusers for refusing to hear his side of the story. He could have quietly allowed for their error, taken solace in the fact that his conscience was clear, and in doing so he could have gone on to be useful and industrious in service of his community as he had originally intended. However, he couldn't let go of it. He obsessed about it. He became ill over it. It consumed him, weakened him, and ultimately killed him. His heart was so full of anger and indignation at this injustice, that there was no room for forgiveness. Even on his deathbed, delirious and fatigued, he was heard to mutter bitterly, "A little piece of string, a little piece of string." When we fall victim to misfortune, it's hard not to obsess, lament, or complain about all that we've lost. In fact, complaining is one of the easiest things to do. It's so easy, many of us do it incessantly. When someone is late to meet us, when our neighbors are too loud, when there are no parking spaces on the one day we are running late, when we watch the news, and so on. We live in a complaint culture that gets high on expressing outrage, especially on social media, which often seems like an endless stream of grumbling and whining about what is unsatisfactory or unacceptable. Even if we don't get caught up in it directly, it can still affect us. With enough secondhand griping, we get emotional cancer. We start to perceive more injustices in our own lives. Those are stormtroopers occupying valuable real estate in our brains and hearts. Have you ever found that the more you complain and the more you read and hear other people complain, the easier it is to find things to complain about? On the other hand, have you found that the more grateful you are, the more you have to be grateful for? Complaining is the quintessential example of something that is easy but trivial. In fact, it's one of the easiest things for us to do. But toxic thoughts like these, however trivial, quickly accumulate. And the more mental space they occupy, the harder it becomes to return to the effortless state. When you focus on something you are thankful for, the effect is instant. It immediately shifts you from a lack state, regrets, worries about the future, the feeling of being behind, and puts you in a have state. What is going right? What progress you are making? What potential exists in this moment? It reminds you of all the resources, all the assets, all the skills you have at your disposal, so you can use them to more easily do what matters most. In the figures below and on the next page, we can see when we focus on what we have, those things expand. You can see that, right? What you lack versus what you have, that's this one. And then when you focus on what you have, circle expands, and then what you lack shrinks. Gratitude is a powerful catalytic thing. It starves negative emotions of the oxygen they need to survive. It also generates a positive self-sustaining system wherever and whenever it is applied. The broaden and build theory in psychology offers an explanation for why this is the case. Positive emotions open up to new perspectives and possibilities. Our openness encourages creative ideas and fosters social bonds. These things change us. They unlock new physical, intellectual, psychological, and social resources. They create an upward spiral that improves our odds of coping with the next challenge we face. Benefits don't stop with us either. When we express gratitude to others, we see their faces light up. They seem less burdened and more expansive. A positive cycle results. When you focus on what you lack, you lose what you have. When you focus on what you have, you get what you lack. That's nice. Complaining, too, creates a self-sustaining cycle. But instead of making it easier to do what matters, this system makes it harder. A downward spiral. When we experience negative emotions, our mindset narrows. Think, fight, flight, or freeze. We are less open to new ideas and to other people. This weakens our personal, physical, intellectual, and psychological resources. It depletes our reserves, making it harder to cope with the very challenges or frustrations that provoked our complaints in the first place. And so it goes. Jim Collins uses this metaphor of a flywheel to illustrate how a self-sustaining system is created. You're pushing no harder than during the first rotation, but the flywheel goes faster and faster. He adds 2 turns, then 4, then 8. The flywheel builds momentum. 16, 32, moving faster, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. Then at some point, a breakthrough. The flywheel flies forward in almost unstoppable momentum. Put simply, a system is self-sustaining if it requires less and less investment of energy over time. Once it is set in motion, maintaining it becomes easier, then easy, then eventually effortless. A recipe for gratitude. My wife, Anna, once had a coworker who was a real challenge. She criticized Anna continuously. She complained about their job and talked about how much she wanted to quit. It was emotionally, mentally, physically draining. But Anna was committed to her job and needed a way not just to cope, but hopefully to forge a more positive, productive relationship. It would have been easy for Anna to get pulled into negativity. It would have been easy for her to come home in the evening and complain about the other woman's complaining. Instead, she decided to actively look for things to be grateful for in her coworker. At first, this was hard to do, but then Anna realized that a lot of the negatives about this woman, if looked at a little differently, could be inverted into positives. When she talked about missing her old job, Anna could be grateful that she had positive things to say about her old job. When she complained about something they were working on, Anna could be grateful she was doing the work. When she criticized others, her observations stemmed from real intelligence Anna could be grateful for that. Once Anna got into the habit of looking for things to be grateful for in her coworker, it became easier and easier to see her strengths. Then Anna was able to compliment her on those strengths that caught her coworker off guard. You could imagine she wasn't getting much positive feedback in general, and it seemed to improve her mood over time. She began to trust Anna, and they grew to become friends, not just colleagues who could tolerate each other, or even colleagues who could get things done together, but friends. And even though they no longer work together, they are still friends to this day. B.J. Fogg, founder of the Behavior Design Lab at Stanford University, says that to create a new habit, we simply need to look for something we already do and then attach a new behavior to it. He calls this a habit recipe, the simplest version of which is, after X, I will Y. We can apply this idea to make gratitude a habit by using the following recipe. After I complain, I will say something I am thankful for. After I complain, I will say something I am thankful for. The moment I started applying this recipe, I was shocked to realize how much I was complaining. I think of myself as a positive, optimistic person. But once I started paying attention, I realized that I was actually complaining quite a lot, often without any awareness. So I resolved to attach gratitude to each and every complaint. When I caught myself saying, getting through airport security was a hassle today, I would add, I'm thankful to be safely on the plane. After grumbling, my son didn't get to his math homework yet, I would say, I'm thankful he is so interested in the new book he is reading. After bemoaning the fact that I was expecting to have lost more weight this week, I would add, I'm thankful I'm watching my weight and my health. After a couple of days of using this rule, I noticed I would start to catch myself mid-complaint and quickly finish my sentence with words of gratitude. It wasn't long before I would catch myself simply thinking about complaining, and I would think of something I was thankful for instead. At first, this shift was deliberate and hard, then it was deliberate and easier, then eventually effortless. Relieve a grudge of his duties. Chris Williams knew what mattered in his life. His family wasn't just the most important thing for him, it was the only thing. Then one freezing night in February 2007, the car he was driving was hit broadside by an erratic teenage driver. Williams' wife and their unborn baby, his 9-year-old daughter, and his 11-year-old son were all killed. His 6-year-old son was seriously injured, and his 14-year-old son, who was at his friend's house at the time of the crash, would never be the same after that day. We would all expect Chris to be swallowed up body and soul by this experience. None of us would fault him for being overcome by fury through his grief. It's the most natural thing to imagine. His resentment closing around him, scarring him, following him around for decades, which is what made Williams' choice in that moment so breathtaking. Minutes after the crash, sitting amid the twisted metal and broken bodies, Williams had an eye of the storm moment of clarity. Not the next day, not a year later, but right there, at this unimaginable, violent scene, he saw two possible lives ahead of him. The first future was one where he indulged his rage and bitterness born in that moment. Choosing that future he knew meant he would be carrying the burden of those emotions for the rest of his life. It meant passing on those burdens to his surviving sons, inflicting emotional scars that might never heal. The second future was one free from those burdens, one where he could be present for his surviving children as they recovered from the physical and psychological trauma they had sustained. It was one filled with purpose and meaning. It might have been the harder choice to make in that moment, but it was unquestionably the one that would lead to an easier life. In that remarkable moment, he decided to forgive. That is not to say he did not feel anger or did not suffer, because he did. But what he didn't do was make the suffering even harder for himself by wallowing in resentment and fury. Instead, he turned his energy, his life force, toward letting go. Have you held onto a grudge against people who hurt you? Wasted precious mental energy being angry, hurt, annoyed, or resentful? How long has the wound been festering? Weeks? Months, years, decades? William's story shows the opposite pattern, and if you could choose a path of forgiveness after the unthinkable tragedy he endured, Surely we can all let go of the grudges that we have been holding on to, which have made it harder to focus on the things we truly care about. A good first step we can take is to ask this unusual question: what job have I hired this grudge to do? According to the late Clay Christensen, a Harvard Business School professor who had been named the world's top management thinker, people don't really buy products or services. Rather, they hire them to do a job. In a similar way, we often hire a grudge to fulfill an emotional need that is not currently being met. But as we conduct a performance review, we discover grudges perform poorly. Grudges cost us resources but don't deliver a satisfying return on our investment. So we must relieve a grudge of its duties. Sometimes we hire a grudge to make us feel in control. We try to prove to ourselves and others that we are right and they're wrong. At first, this can make us feel superior, even powerful. It gives us a sense of control. But one that is fleeting and false, because in reality, a grudge controls you. Like Wormtongue in service to the King of Rohan in The Lord of the Rings, a grudge pretends to be subservient to us, but really takes over. It also keeps us trapped in a never-ending loop of blame, self-righteousness, and self-loathing. There are times we hire a grudge to give us attention. When people hear our story of victimhood, we get their support and sympathy. We are thus incentivized to tell our story again and again. This is easy and even satisfying in the moment, but it delivers an unsatisfying ending. Behind the sympathy people express, there is also fatigue. This is one reason you also have to find new people to tell your story to. We can hire a grudge to get us off the hook. As long as we have someone to blame, we don't have to take responsibility for our anger. We are granted implicit permission to wallow in the negativity we feel without having to justify ourselves to anyone. Again, this feels freeing in the short term, but in the long term, our prize is not freedom. Our prize is living captive to our anger, resentment, and contempt and negativity. We hire a grudge to protect ourselves. We think that being wary of the person or people who hurt us once, we can protect ourselves from being hurt again. We think the grudge creates emotional armor, but this too turns out to be a scam. The grudge makes us more vulnerable, more fearful. It becomes harder to trust, to let anybody in. I once worked with a highly profitable firm. They were operating at $1 million of revenue per employee. While we were discussing how to remain entrepreneurial and lean as they scaled their enterprise, I suggested a rule of thumb. I thought it might sound a little harsh, and it was hire slow, fire fast. It is a good rule of thumb for a growing business and a good rule of thumb for building a grudge-free life. With grudges, we should hire slow or not at all and fire fast. Accept what you can't control. The shock of the diagnosis hit my friend Jonathan Cullen like a train. His unborn son Tristan had Down syndrome. After he was born, Tristan spent months in the neonatal ICU, battling life-threatening health issues. Jonathan's control over the situation was waning by the day, and the more helpless he felt, the more his worry overwhelmed him. Some of his friends stepped up. They sent meals, they called, they offered support and comfort, yet others faded away. These reactions confused Jonathan and his wife. Months into the ordeal, Jonathan realized he had to accept the reality of his friends' behavior. He knew he couldn't change them. All he could do was accept them for who they were. The friends who always sprang into action and helped out in crisis were the ones calling, sending food, anticipating what he and his wife needed without ever asking. Meanwhile, his more passive friends, who tended to retreat when times get tough, were the ones frozen in inaction. Their behavior was probably not malicious. It certainly wasn't out of character, and maybe it shouldn't have been that unexpected. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time, said Maya Angelou. So Jonathan decided to start believing them. He let go of his unrealistic expectations for how he wished they would behave. He accepted reality as it was and would be. Only then could he find true acceptance, the necessary first step toward a new trajectory for his life. For after all, as Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote, the best thing one can do when it is raining is to let it rain. When we let go of our need to punish those who've hurt us, it's not the culprit who is freed. We are freed. When we surrender grudges and complaints in favor of grace and compassion, it's not an equal exchange, it's a coup. And with every trade, we return closer to the calm of our effortless state.